this video that's making the social media rounds, tell me about it.
Well, this was an incident that occurred this past Monday, which first day of school for Fresno Unified. We had all of our traffic officers redeployed around the schools for the safety of students like we do every year. One of our traffic officers was turning the corner at First and Barstow when he saw a student who was running across the street, not using the crosswalk against a red light. The motor officer told this individual to go back to the sidewalk and to cross the street in the crosswalk when the light turned green. The individual ran over to the sidewalk and then walked across the street against the red signal light. The officer again told him to go back to the sidewalk and to cross when the light turned green, and unfortunately the individual continued to walk against the red signal light, looked at the officer and smiled and continued to walk on. The officer made contact with this individual in a parking lot and was going to issue him a citation for walking against the red signal light, and that's when this altercation occurred. And we are doing an internal affairs investigation at this time to look into that contact, that altercation, to determine if there was any policy violations. Still too early to make that determination. We do know that there was video taken by a pedestrian. We also have body-worn camera video from the officers that were present. So all of that is going to be looked at as part of this internal affairs investigation.
It seemed like when the motorcycle cop pulled up, did he actually hit the other kid?
No, what we have learned is that when the motorcycle officer pulled up, the one individual was about 5 feet away from the officer when the officer was on the ground. The motor officer pulled in between the officer on the ground and the individual that was videotaping for the purpose of providing some sort of a barrier from the officer on the ground and that individual.
They were shouting Black Lives Matter. Do you think that the resisting of arrest, is this something having to do with, protesting? Or is this the trend now?
Well, it's not uncommon. Multiple times a day, our officers, just like many others across this nation, as they're making arrests, we hear that common phrase, Black Lives Matter. It's not uncommon for officers to be videotaped as they're making contact with people or making arrests. That happens multiple times per day, and our officers have come to live with that.
What are the officers trained to do? I was talking to someone who said resisting arrest is, what's the procedure if someone resists arrest?
Well, we hope to gain voluntary compliance from individuals. When our officers contact someone and give them commands or directions, the hope is that those individuals will comply. If they fail to comply, then the officer has some options afforded to them in terms of how they approach that situation. The training that we provide our officers is we want officers to de-escalate situations. Even when people are non-compliant, we want them to do whatever they can to de-escalate the situation and to try to calm that situation. Sometimes the officers are successful, sometimes they're not. Depends on the level of resistance offered by the individual they're contacting. And so part of this investigation will look at, did the officer do everything that he could to de-escalate this situation? Sometimes there's additional training needed for officers, but we have a focus in this organization to do everything we can to calm situations through de-escalation. Sometimes it works, sometimes the individual we're contacting doesn't allow it to work.
When the kid was on the ground, what was happening next? Did the police arrest him, or what?
The student that was taken to the ground, he's 16 years of age. He was ultimately arrested for battery on a police officer, as well as for obstruction of justice and for the initial violation of crossing the roadway against a red signal. That individual, at the request of his mother, who showed up to the scene, asked the officer to take him to the hospital to have him examined, which the officer did, and then also booked him into Fresno County Juvenile Hall. The second individual that was there videotaping had gotten very close to the officer. The officers felt that he was attempting to obstruct justice, attempted to make an arrest. That individual ran from the officer on 2 occasions, and then finally the officer was able to make contact with him a 3rd time, and he too was arrested, transported to his mom's house, and issued a citation and released.
What is the kid, what's the penalty for jaywalking, and I guess 2 charges then, would it be?
Well, the one charge was the initial contact on the pedestrian violation for walking across the red signal light after being warned twice not to do so. And then the substantial charge is obviously obstruction of justice and battery on a police officer.
Okay.
Chief, I thought it was looked like a really scary situation in the sense that the officer and the student, who was actually equal in size to the officer, they were on the ground for a fairly long time in a scuffle that could have gone bad if somebody got hold of a gun or something. And the response, it took a long time for backup to get there. Was that a concern to you?
Yeah, what we found was they were on the ground wrestling around for a period of time. Fortunately, the officer did not get seriously injured or the individual get injured. But he did have to wait for a minute or so before the additional officer had gotten there and was able to provide the assistance that he needed in handcuffing this individual.
And one of the fears always when something like that happens, I saw there was comments about a chokehold, but it seems to me an officer in a situation like that there's always a concern that you might lose your firearm, right?
Well, that's always a concern, that when an officer is in a scuffle or on the ground, that firearm protection is the key. Because there are times when an officer does lose their firearm when they're wrestling on the ground. And in this case, he was put the individual in the headlock, held him on the ground until he could get a second unit to come and assist.
What does it say about this? It seems that the idea of all the social media is really, it seems like defiance is becoming more and more common and the way to go in a lot too many situations. Would you say that's true or not?
Well, in this climate today, what we've seen is unfortunately more and more non-compliance and in many cases defiance against police officers, and almost in some cases where some people feel it's okay to resist the direction of an officer. And what we hope for is people to be in compliance, and so that we can avoid these types of altercations. This situation did not have to get to where it did. If there would have been compliance from the onset, this would not have turned into a physical altercation. And at the same time, we want our officers to do everything they can to not allow this to turn into a physical confrontation as well, through de-escalation tactics. And that's our hope for every situation. Unfortunately, in this case, it resulted in a physical battle or a confrontation that ultimately caused both of them to be on the ground.
This is something that I think the parents should be dealing. What's your thought on this?
Well, society in general, we have got to do a better job of teaching our youth that they need to comply with the directions of authority, whether that is an officer or that is a teacher, to follow those directions. And in this case, obviously, that was not that did not occur, and we're seeing more and more of that. But we also want the officers to do everything that they can in that contact to de-escalate situations. So really, there's a responsibility on both parties. The individual's been contacted and the officers.
What was the mother's reaction when she got there? Was it against the police, or was she upset with her son?
I don't know. I wasn't at the scene, so I don't know. I know she is like most mothers to be concerned with the safety of her child, and I believe that's why she wanted him to be taken to the hospital to be examined.
Okay.